Snow had been falling over Chicago for 6 hours. By the time Marcus Hale stepped off the elevator on the 43rd floor of Frostline Tower, the city below had gone white and quiet, and the streets were barely visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass. He carried a manila folder in one hand. His Navy uniform was pressed. His badge, Security, Level 2, caught the overhead light as he paused at the threshold of the executive boardroom. He had never been on this floor before. He'd been told to come here by the compliance system itself. A filing he had submitted 11 days ago under Section 14 of the company's internal audit protocol, suspected irregularities involving financial controls had, after being routed, rerouted, and apparently ignored by 3 different departments, triggered an automatic escalation to the board-level compliance committee. The meeting had already been in progress for 40 minutes when a junior assistant named Priya had found Marcus at the security station near the lobby and told him he was required to appear. He had straightened his collar and taken the elevator. The boardroom was long, glass-walled on 2 sides, with a mahogany table that stretched 20 feet. 12 people sat around it. At the far end, in a charcoal blazer with her dark hair pulled precisely back, sat Eleanor Whitmore, CEO, founder's daughter, the most photographed executive in the Midwest. According to 3 consecutive years of a business publication he'd once read in a waiting room, she was 44 years old, sharp-featured, and currently looking at him the way someone looks at a sentence in a document that doesn't belong there. To her immediate right sat her brother, CFO Richard Whitmore, 51. Silver hair. A practiced calm that Marcus had learned, over weeks of observation, was not calm at all. Marcus walked to the empty chair at the foot of the table. No one offered a greeting. One of the board members, a heavy-set man with wire-rimmed glasses, let out a short sound that was not quite a laugh. 2 others exchanged a glance. Eleanor Whitmore's voice arrived before Marcus could sit. "Mr. Hale." She did not raise it. "I've been told you submitted a compliance filing. Section 14. 11 days ago. 11 days ago." She looked at the folder in his hand. "And the system routed you here. The system escalated the filing when no action was taken within 72 hours. Richard Whitmore shifted in his seat. "Just slightly." Marcus noticed. "We receive dozens of Section 14 filings annually," Eleanor said. Her tone was measured, precise, the tone of someone who had learned long ago that showing irritation was the same as showing weakness. Most of them are vendor disputes, parking violations, inventory discrepancies. She paused. "What exactly are you alleging?" "I'm not alleging anything," Marcus said. He opened the folder and set the first page on the table. "I'm presenting documented irregularities that fall outside normal operating parameters, per the Section 14 definitions." He slid the page toward the center of the table. "I'd prefer to walk through the data." The room was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then the man with wire-rimmed glasses cleared his throat. "He's a security guard," the man said, not quietly enough. Eleanor did not smile. She looked at the page Marcus had placed on the table. She did not pick it up. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I appreciate that the system directed you here, but I think you may have misunderstood." "I understand Section 14 completely," Marcus said. He said it without heat, without apology. He had been a forensic accountant for 9 years. He had testified in federal court. He had presented findings to the SEC. He had done all of that before the false allegations, before the collapse, before the night shift at a building that didn't know his name. He still knew how to read a room, and this room, he noticed, had just changed, not because of what he'd said, because of what Richard Whitmore's hands were doing underneath the table. Folded now, when they hadn't been folded before, knuckles slightly white, because of the way Eleanor's eyes moved not to Marcus, but to her brother. Quick, questioning. Marcus placed the second page on the table. "I'll start," he said, with the loading dock. 3 years earlier, Marcus Hale had been the kind of man whose name appeared in footnotes of federal indictments as the analyst who found the thread, not as the one who unraveled under questioning. He had worked at Callaway and Marsh, a forensic accounting firm in Lower Manhattan, for 9 years. His specialty was transaction pattern analysis, the kind of methodical work that required not brilliance but patience, and an unusual tolerance for staring at numbers until they told you something the people who created them didn't intend. He was good at it. Not celebrated, not particularly visible, but good. He had a reputation among federal investigators for the kind of reports that held up in court. Careful, precise, resistant to rebuttal. He had a daughter, Emma. Born when he was 29, when he was still married to a woman named Christine who had been kind to him until the weight of his hours became too much to share. The divorce had been civil. The custody arrangement had been agreed upon over coffee, without lawyers. Emma spent 4 nights a week with Marcus in a 2-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens, and 3 nights with Christine, who had since remarried a structural engineer named David and lived in White Plains. Emma was 7. She liked drawing buildings. Not cartoonish ones, precise ones. She had a ruler. She was very serious about the ruler. The year Marcus was 33, a partner at Callaway and Marsh named Gregory Fowles had been under investigation by the New York State Attorney General's office for securities fraud. Marcus had not been involved in the case. He had, in fact, been working on an entirely different engagement, a bank in Cincinnati. But he had been in the wrong meeting at the wrong time and had overheard something he shouldn't have. Something about a firm in Delaware, a shell registration, a name he would later find in a filing. He had reported what he heard to the firm's ethics officer, as required. 12 days later, he was placed on administrative leave. The stated reason was a conflict of interest issue from a prior engagement, an issue that had never previously been raised in 9 years of employment. 2 weeks after that, he was terminated. He had retained a lawyer. The lawyer had reviewed the documentation, been thorough and professionally pessimistic, and ultimately advised him that while the termination appeared retaliatory in pattern, the direct causal link was difficult to establish without internal communications he could not compel without litigation. Litigation would cost more than he had. The lawyer was sorry. 6 months later, Gregory Fowles pled guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud. Marcus received no acknowledgement, no apology, and no call. His name did not appear in the press coverage. The firm's ethics officer had since left the company and taken a position at a compliance consultancy in Connecticut. He spent 18 months trying to rebuild, consulting work, contract engagements. He took what he could find. The industry was not large. And the whisper that followed him that there had been something irregular about his departure, something unresolved, was quiet enough to be unchallenged but persistent enough to matter. Doors did not close dramatically. They just did not open. He moved to Chicago when Emma was 5. Christine had accepted a position at a hospital in Evanston and offered to make the move work if Marcus came too. He came. It was the right decision, not because it offered more professionally, it didn't. At first, but because Emma needed both of them nearby. And Marcus had learned by then that some decisions are not primarily about the person making them. He found work as a security guard at Frostline Tower 18 months ago. It paid $22 an hour. The overnight shift, 11 to 7, left his days free. He dropped Emma at school at 8:15. He picked her up at 3:30. He made dinner. He helped her with the ruler. On his kitchen counter, beside the coffee maker, he kept a small legal pad. In the morning, before he slept, he sometimes wrote things down. Observations, not about his current life, about the job. Numbers he'd noticed, patterns in the access logs, discrepancies in the vendor records he'd seen attached to service orders near the loading dock. He wrote them down because he couldn't not write them down. It was how his mind worked. He had not, until 3 months ago, thought any of it would amount to anything. Whitmore Global Holdings occupied floors 30 through 44 of Frostline Tower. The company had been founded by Eleanor and Richard's father, Gerald Whitmore, in 1989 as a logistics management firm. Under Eleanor's leadership, beginning in 2011, it had expanded into supply chain consulting, international freight brokering, and, most recently, technology infrastructure for mid-market distribution companies. It employed 4,000 people across 7 offices. Its annual revenue was, depending on the quarter, somewhere between $800 million and $1.2 billion. Eleanor ran it the way a very precise person runs a complicated machine, with calibrated attention, no tolerance for ambiguity, and an operational structure that had been engineered to produce results without requiring her direct involvement in anything below the VP level. She was not unkind. She was not cruel. She was, by the account of nearly everyone who worked with her directly, deeply fair and thoroughly impersonal. She tracked outcomes. She did not track people. This was both her greatest operational strength and, as events would demonstrate, a significant structural vulnerability. The reorganization Eleanor had implemented in 2020 had been, by most external measures, a success. She had taken a company that was operationally strong but structurally fragmented, the legacy of her father's preference for growth over consolidation, and engineered it into something leaner, more hierarchical, and considerably more profitable. She eliminated redundancies. She consolidated vendor relationships. She created cleaner reporting lines and invested in digital infrastructure that reduced labor costs in 3 of the company's regional offices. She had also, as part of that reorganization, elevated Richard to a role that gave him executive authority over the supply chain and vendor management divisions. At the time, it had seemed logical. Richard was 20 years her senior and had been with the company in a senior capacity since before she took over as CEO. He knew the freight relationships. He knew the international partners. He knew the logistics infrastructure in a way that would have taken Eleanor years to replicate. It made sense to put him where his knowledge was most useful and to build the institutional controls that would catch any problems downstream. The institutional controls had not caught the problem. This would become one of Eleanor's central preoccupations in the months that followed, not just the scheme itself, but the precise mechanics of why the system she had designed had failed to surface it. She would commission an independent review. She would read every page. She would find, eventually, that the failure was not architectural so much as attitudinal. The compliance function had understood its role as protecting the company from external risks, not internal ones. No one had imagined that the risk would sit at the table that set the company's agenda, but that reckoning was still weeks away. Below the executive level, the company's hierarchy was dense and bureaucratic. Middle management was thick with process and protocol. Compliance and audit functions reported to the CFO to Richard, which was standard practice for a company of this size and not unusual in any legal sense, but which created a reporting structure in which concerns escalated not to an independent body, but to a chain that Richard controlled. The security staff knew none of this in detail. They knew the building. They knew the schedules. They knew who had access to which floors, which entrances, which systems. Marcus Hale knew the building better than most. He had been on the overnight shift for 18 months. He had walked every corridor, monitored every camera feed, logged every access event his terminal could read. He knew the custodial staff by name. He knew the vendor schedules, which freight companies came on which mornings, which service contractors used, which entrances, which doors should be locked at which hours. He also knew which things did not match. He had been trained, in a prior life, to think about discrepancy not as error but as signal, not as something to be corrected but as something to be read. A number that doesn't match the one before it is not a mistake until you understand why it doesn't match. Until you understand that, it is a question. Marcus Hale had spent a long time learning to ask questions carefully, without broadcasting that he was asking, without alarming the people whose answers he needed before they had a chance to realize they were being asked. The first time Marcus noticed the truck, it was a Tuesday in October. 2:17 in the morning. He was doing a standard perimeter check of the loading dock on the building's north side, a routine that took approximately 9 minutes and required no particular attention. He had done it perhaps 200 times. The dock was used by 3 authorized vendors, a building supply company that came Monday afternoons, a document disposal service that came Thursday mornings, and a freight broker named Castlegate Logistics that handled outbound shipments for the Whitmore offices twice a week, on Tuesdays and Fridays. Between 9 and 11 in the morning, the truck he saw at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday was not Castlegate. It bore no company markings. Its plates were from Indiana. Two men were loading boxes uniform, unmarked cardboard boxes from a freight elevator that accessed the sub-basement. They worked quickly, without conversation. Marcus stood at the edge of the dock awning and watched for 90 seconds. When one of the men glanced in his direction, Marcus continued his walk without stopping. He did not approach. He noted the plate number, the time, and the truck's make and model in the small notebook he carried in his left breast pocket. He filed the notation when he returned to his station. The second time was a Friday, 3 weeks later. Different truck, same Indiana plates, different two men, same boxes, same freight elevator. 3:40 in the morning. He wrote it down. The third time was a Tuesday in November. He was ready. He positioned himself near the building's north stairwell, inside, where the camera angle covered most of the dock from a distance. He photographed the activity on his phone steady, unhurried, using the building's authorized security documentation protocol, which permitted security staff to photograph activity in common areas when logging a potential irregularity. He photographed the truck, the plates, the men, and the boxes. He photographed the freight elevator doors closing. He also photographed something else. The loading dock had a secondary access panel, a keypad override used when the main dock control station was unmanned. It required a badge swipe and a 6-digit PIN. In the photograph, the arm of the man who had operated the keypad was visible at the edge of the frame. The sleeve of his jacket was pulled back slightly. On his wrist, a watch. On his lapel, a lanyard, and at the end of the lanyard, partially visible, a Whitmore Global Holdings security badge. Marcus cropped and enlarged the image at home that morning after dropping Emma at school. The badge was a Level 4 internal access pass. His own was Level 2. He ran a check on the dock access logs for those 3 nights. Level 4 badge entries at the secondary dock panel corresponded to a credential registered to a name he had seen on internal service orders. Victor Crane, a logistics coordinator listed in Whitmore's internal directory, reporting to the supply chain division under the CFO's office. Marcus wrote Victor Crane's name in his notebook. Then he made a new page and began drawing a diagram. He worked on it for 6 weeks, not continuously, not at the expense of his shift, not at the expense of Emma's dinner or her homework, or the nightly drawing sessions during which she added to her ongoing architectural project a rendered city of her own invention that now covered 4 pieces of poster board taped to the living room wall. He worked on it in the hours between dropping her at school and sleeping, and on weekend afternoons when she was with Christine. His tools were limited by design. He had access to public corporate records, Delaware Secretary of State filings, federal contractor databases, SEC EDGAR, and the court record system he still knew how to navigate from his prior work. He had access to nothing proprietary. Everything he found in documents that were publicly available to anyone with the patience to look. The first company he traced was Northgate Supply Partners, LLC. It appeared in 3 Whitmore vendor invoices he'd seen attached to service orders at the dock, invoices that passed through the freight coordinator's office and required CFO-level authorization. Northgate was registered in Delaware. Its registered agent was a commercial filing service in Wilmington. Its managing member, listed in the original Articles of Incorporation, was a holding entity named Clearview Business Solutions. Also registered in Delaware, also with the same commercial filing agent. Clearview's managing member, listed in its own incorporation document, was an individual, Victor Crane. Victor Crane was also listed in a separate filing as a co-signer on a commercial lease in suburban Indianapolis. The second company, Marcus, identified 2 weeks later. Working backward from a different set of dock activity logs he'd reconstructed from memory and partial documentation, was Meridian Freight Group Incorporated, also Delaware, also a commercial agent. Its managing member was a holding entity called State Line Capital Advisors. State Line's single officer, listed in the filing, was a name Marcus recognized immediately, Richard Whitmore. He sat with that for a long time. He made coffee. He looked at the poster board city on the wall. Emma had added a bridge overnight. Neat pencil lines, ruler straight. He returned to his notes and went back further. Over the following 2 weeks, he traced a third entity. Pacific Basin Consulting, LLC, incorporated in Nevada, with a registered address in Las Vegas. Pacific Basin appeared in Whitmore Global Holdings accounts payable records, not the doc records, but the records attached to internal compliance filings he'd obtained legally through a records request under Illinois corporate transparency statutes, which required the company to disclose general vendor categories to shareholders. He was not a shareholder. But the filings were public. Pacific Basin received payments described as international consulting services. The payments were consistent in timing quarterly and ranged between $300,000 and $900,000 per transaction. The filings he could access showed these payments spanning 3 fiscal years. He did not have access to the exact total, but he could estimate. Conservative estimate, based on the visible transaction cadence and the date ranges in the filings. 47 to 50, $1 million. He set his pen down. He thought, briefly, about what this meant in operational terms. A company with $800 million in annual revenue had, over 3 fiscal years, been losing something between $15 and $17 million a year through a vendor payment scheme that routed money through 3 shell companies to a holding entity controlled by its CFO. The scheme was not subtle in its construction. The structure was visible to anyone who traced it, but it had been designed for a specific kind of invisibility. The invisibility of the unremarkable. Vendor payments, consulting fees, international logistics. These were categories that generated volume, contained legitimate transactions alongside the fraudulent ones, and resided in a reporting chain that ended at the person orchestrating them. It was, Marcus thought, the accounting equivalent of hiding something in plain sight at a sufficient distance that no one thought to look. All 3 companies shared a single feature, beyond the Delaware registrations and the commercial agents. Their creation dates corresponded, within a narrow window, to a restructuring that had occurred at Whitmore Global Holdings in 2020, when Eleanor had reorganized the company's logistics division and elevated Richard to executive authority over supply chain and vendor management. Marcus built the timeline on a fresh page. He wrote the company names, the dates, the dollar ranges, and the signing authority for each payment category. Every authorization chain led back to Richard Whitmore. He did not feel satisfaction. He felt the particular stillness of a man who has been working in the dark and has just found something very solid, and who knows that what he does next will matter more than what he has already done. He filed Section 14 on a Thursday morning. He kept a copy. His supervisor, Carl Benson, a compact, tightly wound man of 50 who had worked building security for 23 years, did not read the report. This was clear from the conversation they had in the break room the following Monday, during Marcus's shift handover. Carl had the report in his hand. He had not opened the envelope. "I need you to understand something," Carl said. He was not unkind. He was careful. This company has a legal team. It has a compliance department. It has auditors. External auditors. If there was something irregular in the financials, one of those systems would have caught it. Unless the irregularity originated within the systems those entities report to, Marcus said. Carl looked at him for a moment. "Marcus, I like you. You do good work. You keep your head down. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I filed under Section 14. I'm not asking you to investigate. I'm asking you to route it. I'll route it." There was another security guard in the break room, a man named Pete Garfield, who had been on the day shift for 11 years and who was, in Marcus's estimation, genuinely content in his work and entirely disinterested in anything that would disrupt that contentment. Pete had been listening from behind his phone. When Carl left, Pete looked up. "I'd let it go," Pete said. "Not unfriendly. I'm telling you that as someone who has been here a long time, the people on 43, they don't like noise from down here." "I'm not making noise," Marcus said. "I filed a document through the approved process." Pete shrugged. "Same thing. To them." Marcus refilled his coffee and went back to the overnight desk. Carl routed it to the compliance department's general intake portal. The intake portal was managed by a team of 4 analysts who reported to the VP of Risk and Compliance, who reported to the CFO. Marcus received an automated response 11 hours later. Your submission has been received. A review will be conducted in accordance with company protocol. Expected response time: 14 business days. On day 4, he received a follow-up. After initial review, the matter described in your submission does not meet the threshold for formal investigation under current audit parameters. No further action will be taken. Thank you for your diligence. He read it at his kitchen table at 8 in the morning, with Emma's cereal bowl still sitting unwashed in the sink. He read it twice. The language was standard. He had seen language like it before, in a different context, from a different company, applied to a different situation. It was the language of a system that had been designed to appear responsive without committing to action. After initial review, a phrase that implied scrutiny but guaranteed nothing. Does not meet the threshold, a phrase that invoked a standard without specifying what the standard was or who had applied it or how. Thank you for your diligence, a phrase that was its own small cruelty, because it told the person who had submitted the report that they had done the right thing while simultaneously doing the right thing to nothing. He photographed the automated response on his phone and checked the Section 14 protocol language one more time to confirm that a non-response within 72 business hours triggered mandatory escalation to the board-level compliance committee. The system had been designed, presumably by lawyers who expected it to function, to prevent exactly the kind of internal obstruction that had just occurred. It would route around the blockage automatically, on a timer, without requiring him to do anything else. He had known this when he filed. He went to sleep. Emma went to school. He set the alarm for 3 in the afternoon, the week before the board meeting. A green sedan he had not seen before sat parked across the street from his apartment building for 3 days. It was there when he returned from his shift at 7:15 in the morning, and gone by the time he left for school pickup. On the 3rd day, it was not gone when he walked Emma to her school. It followed them 2 blocks and then turned off. He kept his face still. He adjusted Emma's backpack strap and talked about the bridge she'd drawn. That evening, he sat in the kitchen after dinner and thought about it with the precision he'd once applied to financial analysis. Someone had identified him as a threat. This meant the filing had been seen by the right people or the wrong ones. It meant the information in his documents was accurate enough to be worth suppressing. Both of these things were, in a narrow sense, confirmations. They were also a clock. The board escalation was now 7 days away. He needed the documents out of the apartment. He needed Emma out of the apartment. He needed to ensure that whatever happened to him in the next 7 days could not also happen to what he had compiled. He thought about the problem the way he thought about any structural problem, not in terms of fear, but in terms of variables and outcomes. The people surveilling him were not law enforcement. Law enforcement did not use green sedans and follow a man and his 7-year-old daughter to school. They were private, which meant they were limited. They could surveil. They could create pressure. They could not, without significant escalation on their part, make his documentation disappear from multiple locations simultaneously. His job was to ensure the documentation existed in multiple locations. That evening, after dinner, he called Christine. He did not explain everything. He told her that he'd submitted a workplace compliance report and that it involved people with resources, and that he thought it would be wise for Emma to stay at Christine and David's house for a week or 2, at least until things resolved. Christine asked 2 questions. He answered them honestly. She said she'd come get Emma the next morning. He told Emma he had some work things to sort out. She looked at him with the particular directness of a 7-year-old who has learned to read silences. "Is it important?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Okay," she said. She packed her ruler. After she left, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and his copies, the documents he'd organized over the past 3 months. The photos, the printed filings, the transaction timeline, the badge records, the doc logs. He had 3 complete copies. One he mailed to a post office box registered in a name he'd used for professional correspondence before. One he left with a neighbor, a retired high school principal named Harold Voss, who had no idea what the envelope contained and had agreed, without curiosity, to keep it safe. The third he kept. He thought about the 9 years he had spent in forensic accounting, reading transactions until they told him what the people who created them didn't intend. He thought about Gregory Fowles, who had taken everything from him without ever using his name. He thought about a Tuesday morning in October, 2:17 a.m., an unmarked truck at a loading dock. He did not feel afraid, exactly. He felt the specific weight of someone who is about to do something that cannot be undone. Carrying it consciously, without complaint. He made coffee. He reviewed his documents one more time. The meeting on the 43rd floor had been called to address 3 items: a quarterly performance review, a proposed acquisition in the Southeast, and the escalated Section 14 filing. Marcus arrived at the compliance escalation hearing prepared for a room that would not want to hear him. He presented in the order he had prepared. He began with the dock access logs, the documented irregularities in overnight vendor activity, the Level 4 badge entries at the secondary access panel, the credential trace back to Victor Crane. He presented without notes. He had the documents. He did not need them to remind him of what they said. He had been through this material enough times that it had become structural in his thinking, not memorized so much as understood at a level that did not require retrieval. 3 board members were taking notes within the first 4 minutes. Richard Whitmore was not. Richard sat with his hands flat on the table, a particular expression on his face that Marcus recognized from prior experience, not from this job, but from testimony preparation. It was the expression of a man deciding whether to attack or wait. He waited. Marcus moved to the corporate structure. He laid out Northgate Supply Partners, Meridian Freight Group, and Pacific Basin, consulting the Delaware registrations, the commercial agents, the managing member chains. He placed a single printed page on the table for each entity. He described the payment cadences, the transaction ranges, the connection to Whitmore's accounts payable records. There was a quality to the room's silence during this section that Marcus recognized. He had been in rooms like this before, in a different life, presenting findings to people who were slowly understanding the scale of what they were hearing. The silence was not agreement and not resistance. It was the sound of comprehension arriving slowly, fact by fact, reshaping what people thought they knew about the organization they worked for, the people they trusted, the years they had spent assuming the systems they operated within were sound. When he reached the slide, not a slide, a printed page, because he had no slide access that showed the management chain of State Line Capital Advisors, Richard Whitmore's name printed in its column, Richard spoke for the first time. State Line Capital was a personal investment vehicle, he said. His voice was measured. It had no operational relationship with Whitmore Global Holdings. The payments to Meridian Freight Group were authorized by Whitmore Global Holdings accounts payable system, Marcus said. The authorization chain for those payments required CFO sign-off. Meridian Freight Group's payments flowed to State Line Capital Advisors per the vendor agreements. He placed the relevant page on the table. State Line Capital Advisors lists you as its sole officer. That's a simplified reading of a complex series of transactions. The digital authorization signatures on the CFO-level approvals for all 3 vendor categories are in this document, Marcus said. He placed another page, their timestamp verified. 46 of 47 transactions over the 3-year period bear your digital signature. The 47th bears Victor Crane's. Silence. Eleanor Whitmore had not spoken since Marcus started his presentation. She was reading. She had been reading since the 3rd page. She read the way she did everything completely, without visible reaction. With the focused quiet of someone who processes information at a level that most people around her cannot track. She reached the transaction timeline. She picked it up. She put it down. She looked at her brother. Richard looked back at her. And for a moment, something passed between them that was not about the room, not about the board members, not about the man standing at the foot of the table. It was something older, something that had nothing to do with Marcus Hale or $47 million or shell companies in Delaware. Then Eleanor said, quietly to the board member on her left. "Get the general counsel," Eleanor Richard began, "and call our outside auditor." "Eleanor, if you'll just—" "Richard." She said it without heat, without drama, without anything that was not precision. "Stop talking." He stopped. The board member with wire-rimmed glasses, who had made the almost laugh when Marcus walked in, was no longer looking anywhere near amused. He was dialing his phone. Eleanor turned to Marcus. Her expression had not softened. It had changed quality, not warmer, but differently focused. Like a lens that had just adjusted to a new distance. "Mr. Hale," she said, "do you have additional copies of these documents?" "Yes," Marcus said. "Please remain available." He nodded. He collected the pages he'd laid on the table systematically, from one end to the other, and returned them to the manila folder. He recapped his pen. He stood at the foot of the table and waited. He had done this before, in smaller rooms. With higher stakes, at the time, he had learned that the moment after a presentation was its own kind of work, the discipline of stillness, while other people understood the implications of what you'd just shown them. He was still good at it. What followed happened in 3 registers, nearly simultaneously. In the boardroom, Whitmore Global Holdings' outside counsel, a firm on the 42nd floor, by arrangement was reached by phone within 11 minutes. Eleanor spoke to the lead partner for 4 minutes. The call concluded with a commitment to have 2 investigators at Frostline Tower within the hour. In a conference room down the hall, Richard Whitmore attempted to reach Victor Crane by phone. Victor Crane did not answer. This was noted by a board member who had observed the attempt and who communicated it to Eleanor's assistant before the hour was out. In the sub-basement, 2 security staff conducted a preliminary inventory of the freight elevator's recent access logs at Eleanor's direct instruction. The logs had been partially wiped. This was not unusual in cases of this kind. It was also not sufficient to eliminate all record, because the building's camera infrastructure maintained a parallel log that had not been tampered with. And Marcus had, 3 months earlier, made a practice of cross-referencing both systems. He had included the camera log data in his documentation. He had not mentioned it in the presentation. He had included it as an appendix. Eleanor found the appendix 20 minutes into her review of the complete folder. She looked up and found Marcus still standing where she had asked him to remain, near the boardroom's entrance. "You cross-referenced the camera system," she said. She held up the appendix. "When did you pull this?" 6 weeks ago. It required a formal access request under the building's security protocol. I submitted it through the system. It was granted as a standard records request. She set the appendix down and was quiet for a moment. The board member with wire-rimmed glasses was watching the exchange from the far end of the table with the expression of a man who is recalibrating several things simultaneously. "Victor Crane," she said. "He's a logistics coordinator in the supply chain division. His badge records show he was present at each of the 3 overnight loading events I documented. He's also the managing member of Northgate Supply Partners." She folded her hands on the table. "And the other 2 entities, Meridian Freight Group and Pacific Basin Consulting. Their ownership structures ultimately trace to State Line Capital Advisors, which lists Richard Whitmore as its sole officer." She was quiet for a long moment. "You were a forensic accountant," she said. It was not quite a question. Before this, she did not ask him what had happened. He did not offer it. Some conversations have a shape that both parties recognize without needing to name it. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I owe you an apology." He waited. "For the way this room received you when you walked in. For the 11 days it took the compliance system to escalate a filing that should have been acted on within 72 hours. She said it without performance, with the same precision she applied to everything. That's a systemic failure, and it reflects decisions I made about reporting structures. It's mine to own." Marcus said nothing. He had not come to this floor for an apology, but he recognized the difference between an apology offered for appearance and one offered from a genuine accounting of failure. This was the latter. "I appreciate that," he said. The general counsel arrived 27 minutes later. The outside auditor's team arrived within the hour, as promised. Federal law enforcement was notified by the legal team at 11:43 that morning, following a brief consultation with Eleanor about the company's disclosure obligations. Richard Whitmore was interviewed in the building that afternoon. He had, for approximately 45 minutes, apparently considered doing so, and had then, for reasons Marcus could not know and did not speculate about, returned to his office and sat at his desk. The board member who tracked these movements described it later to a colleague as the behavior of a man who had been running for a long time and had simply stopped. Victor Crane was located at O'Hare International Airport at 2:19 p.m., attempting to board a flight to Indianapolis with a checked bag that contained, among other things, a personal laptop and approximately $40,000 in cashier's checks made out to business entities that federal investigators would spend the next several months tracing. The arrest was quiet. Most arrests are. 3 weeks passed. The story was covered by 2 national publications and 4 local outlets. The headline in the paper Marcus read at his kitchen table, the actual print edition, which he'd bought from a sidewalk box, read, "Security Guard's Internal Report Triggers Fraud Investigation at Whitmore Global Holdings." The subheadline noted the estimated value of the scheme. Marcus read the article once. He set it on the counter near the coffee maker and went to pick up Emma from Christine's house. She came out of the front door carrying her rolled-up poster board city and her ruler in a tube. "Did you fix the work thing?" she asked, in the car. "Yes," he said. She buckled her seatbelt and looked out the window at the snow, which was beginning again in the tentative, uncommitted way of early December. "Was it bad?" "It was important," he said. "There's a difference." She considered this. "Like when I had to tell Mrs. Houghton that Tyler was copying my test. It was bad, but it was important." Exactly like that. She seemed satisfied. She looked back out the window. He did not tell her what the article said. He would not tell her, not because he was concealing something from her, but because there was no version of it that was relevant to the life they were going to continue living after he dropped her off at school on Monday and picked her up on Tuesday and made dinner and helped with the ruler and the buildings on this wall. The story in the paper was about someone named Marcus Hale and a $47 million scheme. The story he was living was about oatmeal with brown sugar on the side and a ruler in a tube and a city on the living room wall that was already too large for the original 4 pieces of poster board. Those 2 stories had briefly overlapped. They were now separating again, returning to their proper orbits. He was grateful for that. The meeting with Eleanor Whitmore took place 4 days later, in a smaller conference room on the 38th floor. Eleanor sat across from Marcus with the general counsel present and no one else. She had asked for the meeting through a written request, which Marcus had accepted after reviewing it carefully for 24 hours. She did not use the meeting to manage him. He had expected she might have expected the language of liability mitigation and non-disclosure, and corporate gratitude carefully calibrated to minimize ongoing obligation. He had prepared for that conversation and had determined what he would accept and what he would not. He had, in fact, written out his conditions on a fresh page of the notebook, in the same small, consistent handwriting he used for everything else. He had then put the notebook in his jacket pocket and committed the conditions to memory, so that when the moment came, he would not need to read them. A man who reads from notes in a room like that has already conceded something. Instead, Eleanor asked him questions about the investigation, about the compliance filing process, about the specific points at which the system had failed to function as designed. She took notes, real notes, not performance notes she was writing in the margins of a printed document, in the compressed shorthand of someone who had been taking actual notes since before note-taking was a professional skill. At the end of 40 minutes, she put the document down. "I'd like to offer you a position," she said. "Head of Internal Audit. It's a senior role. Compensation at the director level. Full benefits." Marcus looked at the window. Snow again. Always snow. Chicago in winter. He thought briefly he couldn't help it about the New York he'd left, which was also cold in winter but differently cold. The cold of a narrower city, buildings close enough together that the wind came in channels and hit you from angles you didn't anticipate. He had been a different person in that city. He had been the kind of person whose name appeared in footnotes, and who wore suits that hadn't come from consignment shops, and who had not yet learned that the things you build from scratch, without the benefit of title or reputation or institutional backing, are often the most structurally sound. He had learned that. It had cost him 3 years and a career, and several things he was still, on certain evenings, sorting through. But he had learned it. There are conditions, he said. Tell me, the internal audit function reports directly to the board's independent compliance committee. Not to the CFO. Not to any operational executive. Directly to the independent committee. That's a structural change. She held his gaze for a moment. What else? Full, investigative independence. No approval chain for initiating a review. The decision to investigate is mine. The findings go to the independent committee first, and if the independent committee is compromised, then I report to outside counsel and, if necessary, to the relevant federal agency. The protocol is written into the charter, not left to discretion. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. The general counsel made a note. Those are reasonable conditions, Eleanor said. I know, Marcus said. There was a pause that was not awkward. Both of them were people who were comfortable with silence, which made the silence productive rather than tense. You should know, Eleanor said, that I'm going to restructure the entire compliance reporting architecture, not just the audit function. The whole system. I expected you would. You were the only person in this building who used the system as it was designed. I was in a position where I had nothing to lose, Marcus said. That changes what a person is willing to do. She looked at him for a moment, with something that was not quite admiration, and not quite assessment, something in between. It also changes what they're able to see, she said. He accepted the position. He signed the charter documents 4 days later, with the independent committee's counsel present and the language verified line by line. He started on the 2nd of January. On the morning of his first day, he dressed in a gray suit he'd taken to the dry cleaner twice since buying it at a consignment shop in Evanston. He made Emma's breakfast oatmeal with the brown sugar on the side, the way she preferred it, because she liked to control the ratio herself. He left a note on the counter, next to the coffee maker, back at 5. Don't use the ruler without me. She was 7. She would absolutely use the ruler without him. He walked out of the apartment building into the early January cold. The city silver and quiet under its second snowfall of the new year. The streets not yet crowded, the air sharp enough to feel. He stood outside for a moment, his breath visible. His folder under his arm already. On his first day, there were 3 things he wanted to look at. He thought about a loading dock in October. An unmarked truck. The notebook in his breast pocket, which he still carried. Out of habit. Even now. He had written things down because he couldn't not write them down. Because the mind that noticed patterns didn't stop noticing just because the context changed. Because a man can lose his title and his firm and his standing and the particular kind of respect that comes from a business card and still know what a number means when it doesn't match the one before it. He flagged a cab. Behind him, in the apartment, Emma was already at the kitchen table with the ruler, adding to the city on the wall. She was drawing a new building taller than the others, with clean lines and a series of windows that caught the light in precise, equal intervals. She was very serious about it. She got that from him.